Here's a look at a recap of your markets on this Friday, the 26th day of September. We'll start off today taking a look at a couple of our tracking measures. The Missouri Stocker formula, based roughly on a 550-pound steer through the auction barns in the state of Missouri on Friday, setting at 425.52. That's about $8 higher compared to last Friday. The CME Cash Feeder Cattle Index, based on an 800-pound steer up through the 12-state feeding region, setting at 365.04. That would be about $6 higher than last Friday. Taking a look at the feedlot trade as of the 2 o'clock cutoff time on Friday afternoon, 52,652 head. Texas reported 1,143 head, with a live price of $237. That's $3 lower than last week. Kansas, 2,917 head. Live prices reported at $235 to $237. That'd be about $3 to $5 lower than last week. Those southern regions still maintaining that premium over the north that they picked up last week. In Iowa, they turned in 19,768 head as of the 2 o'clock cutoff time. Live sales in Iowa at $230 to $233. That's mostly $5 lower. Dress sales at $365. In Nebraska, 20,451 head. Live sales report at mostly $232 to $235. That'd be about $4 to $6 lower than a week ago. Dress sales at $365, which would be about $5 lower than a week ago. Taking a look at the box beef cutout values, choice closed on Friday at $371.43, down 54 cents for the day, down $10.62 for the week. Select $352.44, down $1 and a penny for the day, down $7.48 compared to last Friday. That makes the Choice Select spread at $18.99. Volume on Friday, 95 loads of cuts, trimmings, and grinds. Before we move on, want to take just a minute or two to talk about those box beef cutout values, kind of take a bigger look at where we are from the 30,000 foot mark or so. That choice, it kind of started moving upwards about April. Past the 350 mark in mid-May, climbed all the way up to 396 prior to the 4th of July holiday. After that, it turned and started dropping all the way back down to 361 as of the end of July. Then we made the near record-breaking climb up to 416 for the pre-Labor Day holiday. And then we turned around and started dropping back to where we currently are at 371.43. The only other time we've been above the 350 mark that we passed back in mid-May, you'd have to look all the way back to the oddball occurrence in 2020 for the COVID back in May. And of course, that was the actual all-time records. But of course, that was a kind of a freak incident when that happened. But I say all that to just point out the fact that even with the volatility that we've seen in between the holidays this summer with the grilling season and all, even at 371, we are at a very high level for those box beef cutout values still. Taking a look at what happened at the auction barns around the state this week. Kind of a slower week this week. We did end up with about 20,000 head. However, near half of those all came from Joplin Regional Stockyards on Monday. Nearly all the northern sales this week, they had an off-scheduled week before it ever started, so they were expected to be dark. So not a lot of cattle movement in the north, and then many of the auctions in the south. Of course, we did get some much-needed rain this week, and it was amazing at how fast a green tint came back to many areas, but most of those auction barns very slow, especially mid to late week. That being said, prices were phenomenal. There weren't a lot of large drafts of cattle at the later auction barns. Most of small drafts and 10, 12 heads, something like that. But still some phenomenal prices were found. When we look at the stick-out sales this week of drafts over 20 head, they pretty much came from about a couple of auction barns early in the week. Tina Livestock Market and then Joplin Regional Stockyards. On Monday at Callaway, they did have a stickout sale of 37 head of 509-pound steers at $485. The average statewide this week on those light 5-weight steers at $446. Tina had 20 head of 541-pound steers sell at $459. 21 head of 615-pound steers at $443.50. Joplin Regional Stockyards, they sold 140 head of 713-pound steers at $402. The average statewide on those light 7 weights this week at $387. 336 head of steers at Joplin, averaged 772 pounds, brought $403. 117 head of 814-pound steers at Joplin, $367. And then a full load of 856-pound steers at Tina Livestock Market brought $370. On the heifer side, Callaway had 48 head of 510-pound heifers at $412. The average statewide on those light 5-weight heifers this week, $398. Tina had a load of 661-pound heifers at $387. Joplin sold 33 head of 715-pound heifers at $376. The average statewide on those light 7-weight heifers this week at $360. Taking a look at the futures markets on the Mercantile Exchange for the week, live cattle 32 cents to $1.77 lower, except for April of 2026, and it closed 33 cents higher. Lean hogs this week $1.28 to $3.53 higher, and then feeder cattle, after all the ups and downs in the very volatile week, they ended up closing $2.90 to $4.28 higher. On Friday, October live cattle closed 25 cents lower, $231.80. December $234.30 unchanged. February $236.50 up 45. October feeder cattle up $295 on Friday, closing at $357 even. November up $225 at $354.47. January at $347.82 up $187. Lean hogs October $101.50 up $1.40. December $91.05 up $242, and February $92.17 up $225. Turning our attention to the grain markets now. Of course, many producers around the state were getting harvests well underway before the rains hit earlier this week. As of the latest crop progress report, which was released last Sunday based on last Sunday's data, corn harvest was at 28% in the state. Soybean harvest at 7% complete. Both of those slightly ahead of the average, however, given the little progress that took place this week, probably fell back really close to average progress at this point when we see the report come out Monday with Sunday's data from this week. Cash grain bids on Friday at the elevators around the state. Corn was 2 to 6 lower, beans a penny higher, and wheat 7 cents lower. Corn bids in St. Louis on Friday, $4.21 to $4.22. Kansas City, $3.94. Soybean bids, St. Louis, $9.86. Kansas City at $9.28. Wheat bids in St. Louis, $4.59 to $4.69. Taking a look at the futures markets. For the week, soybeans were 11 to 12 cents lower, wheat 2 to 3 lower, corn 2 to 3 lower, Kansas City wheat 1 to 3 lower. Then the soybean meal, $5.80 to $14.10 lower. On Friday, December corn down 3 3/4 at $4.22, March down 3 1/2, $4.38 3/4, and May at $4.48 down 3 1/4. November beans up a penny and a half on Friday, $10.13 3/4. January up 1 3/4 at $10.33, March at $10.49 up 1 1/2. Wheat for December, $5.19 3/4 down 7 1/4 for the day. March at $5.38 1/2 down 6 3/4. May at $5.50 1/4 down 6 1/2. Soybean meal for October, 20 cents a ton higher at $268.80. Soybean oil for October down 14 cents a hundredweight at $49.60. That's a recap of all your markets for this week. With the Missouri Department of Agriculture, this is Tony Hancock.